all 4 of those fights into one segment.
I think Clark might win now.
I'm picking her for sure.
I mean, there's a chance VanZant comes back from her camp change looking different. But have you seen the camp that she's training at?
Yes, I have.
Burke camp?
Aside from the fact that she has like an uber hot new boyfriend who is a tremendous looker, I don't feel like, it's not great.
Much has changed. Dan Burke is apparently an Ajaran Chai guy, like a Thai boxing association. So,
oh really?
Could be legit. Could be like a guy who gives out belts and does like a McDojo. Very hard to tell.
It's like Portland is not. There's some really good jiu-jitsu in Portland, but there's like no place in Portland to get really good striking training. There's no good boxing gyms. There's no good Muay Thai places. Yeah. There's nothing.
I mean, I'll just say when I took a look at the page, because I was like, who is this? I looked at, as I often do, I looked at Paige's Instagram, and I was like, okay, I'm going to find out what camp she's at. And I found one post that said The Real Burke or whatever. And I was like, okay, who's this? Go to the website of Burke Camp, and I don't know anything about this instructor. I cannot make any judgment calls, but the photo he had of himself was like him kneeling in a Buddhist temple, holding his hands up in like the Michael Bluth prayer pose. And he's like a white man. Like, I don't know. It was just a little like, so I don't know. I don't know what kind of vibe I get from that.
It's not good.
Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands number 2 of the new year, and our fresh new outlook has already died. Pat and I are back to our usual malaise. Pat, both of us, back to hating the world, back to being embittered, darkened souls. Does that about capture it?
Yeah.
Takes about a week, after the resolutions. But we are still doing Heavy Hands, and for this special, very dark, tortured edition of the show, we are going to be talking about UFC St. Louis, I believe they are calling it, also known as UFC Choi versus Stevens versus Choi. Those men being Jeremy Stevens and Ho Choi, the Korean Superboy, who are fighting one another in the main event. I think Pat and I both think that is quite a compelling fight. We're also going to talk about several fights from the undercard, namely Uriah Hall versus Vitor Belfort, Paige VanZant returning at women's flyweight against Jessica Rose Clark, Kamaru Usman, one of our favorite top welterweight contenders, fighting Emil Weber Meek, and then Darren Elkins and Michael Johnson in the featured prelim on Fox Sports 1. Let's kick things off with the main event. Pat, Jeremy Stevens, Ho Choi. I'll first give you the chance to agree or disagree. This is a pretty damn good matchup.
It is a damn good matchup. And I think it is a prime example of the kind of matchmaking that that Mick Maynard and Sean Shelby do really well and have done really well since they took over things, where not only is it a matchup that makes perfect sense for Ho Choi in terms of figuring out kind of where he's at after the Cub Swanson fight, where he's at after spending yet another year out with injury. It's all of those things, but it is also a really excellent stylistic matchup. I really think that Maynard and Shelby understand stylistic matchups and how two guys are going to play against each other. And so what they've given us is, like, in the context of the featherweight division, Stevens is pretty firmly like the 10th or the 12th best fighter, somewhere in the range between 9 and 12. But like, that doesn't quite capture the way in which he is a hard matchup for a striking first fighter like Choi.
Absolutely.
Like, it's not so to beat him. Choi is either going to be forced into a wild ass brawl, which would be tremendously entertaining and would build him as an action fighter, or he's going to be forced to show something beyond the kind of the skill sets that he's shown so far, and by doing so, prove himself to be a really outstanding fighter, like a guy with real serious future potential in the division. Or basically, you're either going to get a wild brawl, a Jeremy Stevens knockout, in a fun fight, or the emergence of a new contender.
Yeah, and what can probably, to my mind, will only be, if it's not a brawl, it'll be one of those tactical wars. I don't really see a way for this fight to be like slow and neither man really putting his stamp on it. Because both these dudes like to put their stamps specifically on people's chins. And I'm not talking about mushroom stamps, Pat, okay? Before you say that, that's not what I'm talking about. Both of these guys are completely willing to land shots and have a compulsion to do so. You know what I mean? Even after the Cub-Swanson fight, I'd be surprised if Ho Choi had learned any kind of lesson in the sense of like, don't try to hit people really hard. And so I think we're going to see some exchanges, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Tell me how much boxing has infected my brain, because part of me does think this might be too much for the young Ho Choi. After the Cub-Swanson loss, which is a kind of fight that can take a lot out of a promising young prospect. It was the first time he's really gone to war that much. And also, you know, his first loss since his third pro fight. And now he's fighting Jeremy Stephens, who, as you said, is not one of the top-ranked guys. He's not on Swanson's level in that regard, but he's definitely a very dangerous matchup, specifically for a fighter like Choi. So,
I think that you hit on something key, which is what will that last fight have done to Ho Choi's psyche and mentality and approach? I think if he approaches this exactly the way he approached the Swanson fight, then he's going to win handily. And I'll tell you why. Because Cub Swanson can fight off his back foot. He can counter you as he moves backwards. He may not win the fight that way, but he can fight that way. Like, that is, he can stick and move. He can go in space. He can toss his jab out there. He's got great footwork. If you overcommit to a strike, he's going to be right there with a variety of counters for you. Even if he wins the fight out in the middle of the cage or with him pressing forward, that's how Swanson eventually like turned the tide and got the momentum. Mm-hmm. He's not going to get blown out, which is what we saw in like the first round of that fight. He's not going to get blown out if he's getting pressured. Jeremy Stephens, if he's getting pressured, is going to get blown out. That's the difference between those two guys. That's why Stephens is not like a top 5 fighter the way that Cub Swanson is. It's because Stephens is either planting his feet and throwing, or he's kind of moving forward.
I did have the same thought, but I want to tell our listeners about the tale of two Jeremys as a counter to that, because that, to me, in my mind now, this is the difficulty in predicting this fight and having a really clear idea of how it's going to play out for me. Because versus Renato Carneiro, Jeremy Stephens, on a night in which he looked particularly flat, but that's about as bad as the stylistically limited Jeremy Stephens gets. You know what I mean? Like, that's as bad as his limitations get, where was basically reduced to being a fighter who could only fight coming forward, could not cut off the cage, and was mostly just throwing single power shots. He basically turned into Sam Sicilia for 15 minutes against Renato Moicano, and that's not a good look. But then, in his very next fight against Gilbert Melendez, Jeremy Stephens was fighting off the back foot for the last 10 minutes of that fight. He was giving ground. He was probing with his jab. He was feinting. He was throwing touching combinations, not putting power into them, just throwing quick pot shots and then angling off to the side, something I have never seen from Jeremy Stephens before. And I know Gilbert Melendez is not a particularly good pressure fighter, and he was forced to come forward largely because his leg was fucked from the first 2 minutes of the fight, but it was by far the best I've ever seen Jeremy Stephens off the back foot. And so I kind of wonder who is worse off the back foot between Choi and Stephens. And if Stephens can come in and force Choi backwards, is that a bigger problem for Ho Choi at this point than it is for the very experienced Jeremy Stephens, who might have a few more tricks up his sleeve on a good night than we kind of expect?
Okay, so I disagree with your assessment of Jeremy Stephens moving backwards in that Melendez fight. Okay, I think that he did not get blown out there, but he didn't get blown out there because Melendez is not great at pulling the trigger when he's pressuring. Like, that to me was less about what Stephens did in those situations and more about what Melendez couldn't do because his leg was jacked, because he's getting older, because he's just never been that comfortable there.
He's Gilbert Melendez. Like, there's a huge difference between him pressuring and Ho Choi pressuring. He's
a boxer puncher. Like, Gilbert Melendez is not a dude who feels really comfortable getting after you. That's just not his game. Like, he can do it in bursts like he did to Anthony Pettis successfully in the first round of their fight, but it is not where Melendez feels comfortable. His
True.
defense goes to shit when he pressures because it's not what he's comfortable doing. And he was still finding opportunities. He did not have that much trouble backing Stevens up to the fence. You know,
True. He still got him there.
And regularly, repeatedly, without being a fantastic cut you off, force you backwards kind of pressure fighter. Stevens allowed himself to get pressed back because Stevens is not that great off his back foot. Now, when Stevens really did damage to Melendez, it was when he planted, generally in the center of the cage, or when he found moments to press forward. He landed some shots off his back foot, sure, but they were scare you off shots, force you to acknowledge that you're not going to get free shots, not this is a thing that I'm going to feel comfortable doing over and over. Now, you're right to point to the fact that Ho Choi is not great off his back foot, but he is actually still dangerous. He can throw step back right hands and left hooks. He can draw you onto shots. If you stay after him, if you keep on him, then you can force him backwards. He tends to move back like at least 2 or 3 steps in a straight line before he angles off. So you can make hay there. That is possible. But if we're talking about who is more likely to allow themselves to be driven backwards, it's Jeremy Stevens and not Choi.
Yeah, I do agree with that because Melendez, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you just said. Those are all good points. But I very much agree with Stevens being easier to pressure. Like, Cub Swanson had a hard time convincing Choi to go backwards. He had to stand in the pocket with him, and even then he was continually forced back himself because Choi is very comfortable. He has a huge amount of faith in his offensive potency, I think. And so he's very comfortable just in the pocket. Even if he's not the most defensively savvy fighter in the world, even if he doesn't have like a massive range of offensive tools, like he throws like, all that aside, he's very comfortable in the pocket. And so it's harder to back him up than it is most fighters. Stevens definitely did get backed up by a shot Gilbert Melendez. Maybe it was a strategic choice, but as soon as Melendez came out in round 2 after having his leg destroyed and knew because of his corner's instructions that he had to move forward as much as possible, he was able to do so. So that's definitely a difference. How do you think Choi responds to the leg kicks of Jeremy Stevens?
That's actually something I was going to ask you about because that has turned into a real weapon for Jeremy Stevens. Yeah. He has gotten he has crushing power in them. He will commit to them. And the thing that's particularly relevant in this Choi matchup is that he's pretty defensively sound on them. Like, he immediately covers up after he throws one and tries to get his head offline and tries to take angles. So it's not like he's just standing in front of you and kicking. Like, because Choi will just blast you if you throw a naked kick standing right in front of him.
Sure.
He has great timing on those. That was what he nailed Swanson with at the very beginning of that fight and got Swanson's respect right off the bat was Choi had the trigger ready the second that Swanson threw a kick. So if Stevens is not paying attention and he gets lazy, Choi can hit him. But Stevens, Melendez tried to counter Stevens' kicks early in that fight, in the first round of their fight, and had his right hand ready, had the timing on it perfect. And Stevens, after he threw the kick, had his hands up. He just parried. He just blocked it. Yeah, it was really good fundamental kicking technique.
Yeah, and I do wonder, like, I can't recall any fights in which someone has really gotten the chance to kick the shit out of Ho Choi's front leg, but he stands very heavy on it. It's actually one of my least favorite things about his game is that he's really locked into, kind of like Rory McDonald. He's really locked into that weight forward posture. And most people can't capitalize because they just don't want to stand in the pocket. But a leg kick is a potent counter to that kind of stance. To take someone's leg out from under them while all of their weight is on it is much easier than somebody who keeps a light leg and can check or move it out of the way at a moment's notice. So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting fight. I think it's a really fun matchup. I think Jeremy Stevens is going to have a lot of difficulties to pose to Ho Choi. But I'm not sure if I see it coming together into a really cohesive game plan to beat Ho Choi.
That's a really, really good way of putting it because I see like there's a lot of individual pieces here, right? There's the low kicks, there's the not letting Choi pressure him with impunity and being willing to throw, which we've seen a little bit more from Stevens. We've seen improved footwork from Stevens. Like, it's not going to be as easy to pressure him as it would have been a few years ago. There's his raw toughness. There's his better cardio. Like he can fight deeper into fights than he used to be able to. There's his power. I mean, like we know he can hit. Like we know he's a hitter.
Yeah, and again, like as with Cub Swanson, I think durability is a huge factor. Like being able to take Choi's shots. I don't know. That means it's going to get messy, but doesn't mean Jeremy Stephens can win. Can he do what Cub Swanson did?
Yeah, these are the questions that we kind of need to be asking here. And I think he will have success. I think he will chew up Choi's legs pretty good. But I don't think he's going to be able to keep the pace with Choi and feel comfortable doing it. Like Melendez, after a while, kind of didn't have that much for him, you know? And the pace substantially dropped. Stephens kept throwing and kept landing, but Melendez couldn't. Melendez was incapable of sticking with that, and I think Choi will. I think Choi will be able to. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. Like Ho Choi, his stamina was an issue against Cub Swanson. Cub did a great job of working his body, but Stephens can do that. And Stephens, his conditioning still looked really good against Melendez, especially because he was throwing a lot of power kicks. In that fight.
It's less about cardio and more about how do you feel if the fight is not going the way that you want it to.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I don't think that Stephens ever felt like he wasn't in control against Gilbert Melendez.
That is a very, very good point because he won every single round of that bout, no question.
And I'm thinking back to fights where Stephens has not felt like he's been in control of what's happening. In the Frankie Edgar fight, in the Renato Moicano fight, in the Max Holloway fight, Stephens kind of settles into a middling pace in those kinds of fights. He's not looking to push it. He doesn't really string combinations together. He kind of lets one or two shots go at a time. It's the young veteran thing, you know?
Yeah, but he can definitely, if he's not in control, but he's getting in as many licks as the other guy, then it's like the Dennis Bermudez fight or the Renan Barao fight, where he can kind of turn the burner up a bit and throw some extra intensity in it. He will adapt and bring it to his opponent, you know?
I'm just not sure I agree with that. Like, I think, look at the volume of strikes that he's throwing in those fights.
Yeah.
It's really pretty consistent. He lands 3 to 4 shots a minute. The only outlier to that is the Melendez fight, where Melendez was so obviously messed up that, like, there was not much that he could do back. Otherwise, he's been consistent at that pace going back to like 2014. So for like the last 4 years, he has kept pretty much the same pace, or even further back than that. Like it's really, really a consistent kind of pace that he falls into. Like Cub Swanson was able to just fight him at that pace and beat him at that pace. It's basically the same pace he kept against Dennis Bermudez. It's the same pace he kept against Max Holloway, the same pace he kept against Renan Barao. And I just think Ho Choi is a little better equipped to up that pace by like 1 or 2 strikes a minute. Not a huge margin, but enough that it's noticeable if you're both power punchers over the course of a fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Choi's also got a lot of those little answers for Stephens' game as well. Like Choi is very good in the clinch. He's extremely difficult to hold down if Stephens comes into this fight thinking that his wrestling is going to be an edge for him. It's not like Stephens has a ton that I think will really surprise Ho Choi. So yeah, I mean, I'm leaning towards. I mean, I was leaning towards Choi from the beginning. It feels like a default pick, and that always makes me nervous. But it does seem like the right pick still.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you can have a lot of respect for Jeremy Stephens' game and think he's a really good fighter, and I think we both do. I think we both have a lot of respect for his craft and the way that he's broadened himself out as a fighter.
Sure.
But like I think in a lot of ways this comes down to whether you're a believer in Choi or not. Like whether what you saw from him in that Cub Swanson fight it makes you think less of him or makes you think that there's a cap to how good he can be. And I really tend to think that he still has a lot of potential that he's scratching.
I agree. I think that was as what we usually term a prospect loss.
Mm-hmm. And just because of the kind of fighter he is, it ended up being like pretty much the fight of the year last year, or one of the fights of the year last year.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, with another year of training under his belt against I think a less imposing opponent skill-wise with a little bit less depth and breadth to his game. I don't know. I like Choi. But I think it's going to be a hell of a fight.
Yeah,
it'll be really...
So
It'll be slow for some periods, and then there are going to be moments of insane violence, and eventually a really fun fight is going to break out.
Looking forward to it, man. Once again, looking forward to it. And both of us go on with Ho Choi in what we expect to be a very fun fight. Before we wrap up this segment, let's say a little, at least, about the co-main event, which is Uriah Hall versus Vitor Belfort. Kind of a weird one. I'll be honest with our listeners, Pat. I wasn't initially intending for us to talk about this fight because, frankly, it kind of makes me sad and it kind of makes me bored. And I don't really know what to make of it. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I do know what you mean. I think it's less interesting for the two fighters who are involved in it and more interesting kind of for each one represents, which is Belfort continuing to get after it, continuing to be out there, despite the fact that he is... Let's run this back here. He is currently
100 years old.
Yes. I mean, actually, looking at it, his recent run, they're all losses to top 5 guys. Weidman, Jacare, Musasi, Gastelum. Those are all elite fighters.
Yo, Belfort is still fighting because Belfort's actually still pretty good. Like, relative to your average mixed martial artist, Belfort is still undeniably one of the best in the world. I think... and that includes like top 25, top 30, which, that's pretty broad, but there's thousands of middleweights out there. I am going to once again air my unpopular opinion that Vitor Belfort versus Nate Marquardt was a pretty decent fight. Of a slow but tactical and interesting fight in which both guys looked like fighters that, could still beat a top level opponent on a good night.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what makes this interesting, is that guys beat Vitor by pushing the pace, and Uriah Hall is a guy who has traditionally been very willing to kind of fight at a lackadaisical pace.
Yeah.
So, like, if Hall pushes it at all, I think he's going to just crumble Belfort's chin. But if he doesn't, and if he kind of slips into this weird, like, tit-for-tat fight over the course of 15 minutes and doesn't land that one big shot, which is always possible. Like, that's, it's kind of a percentage thing. If he just doesn't land one that has that effect on Belfort, you go to a judge's decision and they've landed, 38 and 30 strikes respectively. Mm-hmm. Like, that becomes a really kind of close, interesting thing. I don't know. Like, I think this, either it's going to be a devastating knockout or it's going to be a really, really slow decision. And I just think, like, that's kind of an interesting dynamic. I don't think I'm going to enjoy watching this fight, but it's an interesting dynamic.
You kind of sold me on it a little bit. Like, even though here's the crazy thing. I'm being sold on this while I'm looking at these numbers. And this is painted some by fights in which Vitor was just held down. But Uriah Hall lands 3.13 significant strikes per minute. Fairly low. I mean, not middling at best. Vitor Belfort, according to Fight Metric, 1.63, which does paint the picture of a pretty slow matchup. Both guys being willing, especially in his old age, both guys being willing to pick their spots and let a lot of time go by in which there are no spots and they're both just looking at each other. But it means the spots will be very decisive when they are picked, if you know what I mean. So...
yeah, I think that's exactly it.
that very elegant description that I gave. I think I might pick Vitor Belfort just because it'd be really funny if he wins. And honestly, like, this is the kind of matchup in which, much like the Nate Marquardt fight, like, he can get his shots in here. And even though Nate Marquardt might be more fragile, he sometimes reacts better to taking a shot than Uriah Hall does. I don't know. I'm going to go with Vitor. I don't really have any strong reason to, but it sounds fun.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Hall will at some point land that shot.
Probably.
I'm not super confident in it, but I think at some point he'll land. Like, if you can knock out Krzysztof Jotko, who's a pretty tough dude, I think you can knock out Vitor Belfort.
Yeah, I'm banking on
year of our Lord 2018.
I'm banking on a 15-minute Uriah Hall brain fart to get the old lion the win.
entirely possible.
All right, and that is entirely the end of our first segment. When we come back, we are going to get into the rest of this undercard, as noted before, kicking things off with Paige VanZant versus Jessica Rose Clark after this break. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. We are going to kick this segment off with Paige VanZant versus Jessica Rose Clark. An interesting fight in the now burgeoning women's flyweight division in the UFC. Paige VanZant moving up to 125 after a bit of an unsuccessful end to her run at 115. Apparently she was, actually the picture she was posting online sort of confirmed she was going through some pretty brutal weight cuts to make 115, so I can't complain about her moving up. Jessica Rose Clark will hopefully make weight for 125 this time around in her UFC debut with Beck Rawlings. She was, do you recall how much she was over the limit, Pat? A few pounds?
2 pounds. She came in at 128, I believe.
Okay, all right, so not too far off. Seems like she probably can make that weight. Interesting fight, I think. I think that Jessica Rose Clark, while her record is not very glamorous, at this point, neither is Paige VanZant's really, and I think these two are kind of on a par with one another in a lot of ways. I think there's probably, I haven't looked at the odds, but my feeling is that people will still be favoring Paige VanZant because of her popularity and everything. The matchup, I think, will be more competitive than that.
Rose Clark, at last I checked, was a small favorite. She was like minus 150.
Then I'm happy about that. I think that makes sense. That's kind of how I feel about the fight.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of how to put this. Like, I don't see any particular reason to be a believer at this point in Paige VanZant long term. We have not seen the kinds of improvements from her that should lead us in that direction. It's entirely possible that she makes them. She's not at alpha male anymore. Maybe that means she's getting more kind of individualized instruction, which it strikes me as really what she needs. Like, she really needs somebody to teach her basic fundamental technique.
Yeah.
And maybe if she's not at a big camp, if she's kind of doing her own thing, she'll get the kind of fundamental technical instruction that she needs. But with that said, her mindset seems to vary so wildly from fight to fight that it's really hard for me to understand what she actually is and what she's trying to do as a fighter.
How do you mean her mindset?
So is she a swarmer? Is she a pressure fighter?
Okay, yeah.
Or is she a stick and move out fighter? She's not very good at being a stick and move out fighter, but so why has she spent her last 2 fights trying to do that?
Well, Pat, she's not that good at being a swarmer either, if we're honest.
Well, but it plays on the fact that she's durable. Yeah. She has great cardio. She has a decent offensive takedown and top game. When you're sticking and moving off your back foot with subpar striking skills, what are you doing? Like the kick she landed on Beck Rawlings was pure chance. She was well on her way to losing that fight.
Yeah, I mean, and it was set up. She got Beck. It was that little double midair switch kick. I'm not sure what to call that, to be honest. Scissor kick, maybe. And, Beck Rawlings fell for the feint. But it's not like Paige did a ton to establish it. It's not like she was consistently operating in the range and that kick was getting closer and closer as the fight went on. Beck Rawlings just had a brain fart of her own and got caught. And that's kind of how I understand it. We were talking before we began recording today about Paige VanZant's technique, and you basically said that more than anything, it's technical deficiencies that are holding Paige VanZant back, rather than a lack of athletic ability or anything like that, or mental toughness. I mean, she sure as hell is very, very tough. I have not seen many fighters who stay as poised as she does when being choked. But her technique, Pat, is just not very sharp. It's not clean. You know what I mean? She doesn't throw nice straight punches. She doesn't seem to have a feel for her distance. That's, as we've said many times, that's one of the things that tends to mark somebody out as a comfortable striker, is that they know when something is almost going to hit them, but not quite, and so they don't have to react. Paige VanZant does not have that. She doesn't exhibit that knowledge. You know what I mean? She doesn't seem to be able to tell when she's in range to be hit and when she's not. So when she's doing her weird outfighter thing, she's frequently like a full 6-7 feet away from the woman in front of her. Way too far away for either of them to, with just a single step in, hit the other. And that tells me that she's not very comfortable with her distance.
Yeah, because it takes practice and fundamentals to get good at managing distance, and she doesn't really have that.
We're gonna be as harsh to Paige VanZant as I was to Holly Holm, I guess.
Well, she's not a novice at this point. She's been fighting as a professional for more than 6 years.
Yeah.
Like, you at this point, even though she started young, she started as an 18-year-old. If you were talking about 23-year-old Jose Aldo, who was at that point 6 years into his career, and you were levying criticisms, you would be right to do that.
Sure.
If you were talking about the 2012 version of Rory McDonald as having technical deficiencies, you would feel comfortable doing that. If you were talking about the Jordan Meehan, who was fighting guys at a high level in like his first couple of UFC fights, you would be having the same conversation. Mm-hmm. Those are all fighters who started young. The fact that like she deserves to be held to roughly that same standard.
Yeah.
So, like, especially for somebody who has been pushed and been put in matchups with high level opponents, like, that is the correct standard according to which she should be judged. So the question is, what would a good version of Paige VanZant look like? Knowing what we know about her, she's reasonably athletic. She's got good cardio. She's good in scrambles. She's good from the top. She's durable. She's pretty mentally tough. What do you think a good, like, the right version of her looks like? Let's flip this around. Instead of focusing on what she has not done well to this point, what would a good version of her look like? And how would that match up with what we've seen from Jessica Rose Clark?
Well, my first instinct is to guess that because it's what she does naturally, that Paige VanZant is probably better suited to being more of a come-forward fighter. It doesn't really seem to me that she has a good grasp on how to transition from skittling around on the outside to actually setting up and landing shots or initiating any kind of attacks from that position. So my instinct is to say she should go back to being a little more aggressive. I think a better version of Paige VanZant would, however, dial that aggression down a little bit. Have a little more discipline, feel the distance out as you come in. That would help her tremendously if she was comfortable coming forward behind like a pawing jab, behind nice teeps and feints of those kinds of strikes, something to get her range as she comes forward. And I think a good Paige VanZant would focus on working herself towards the clinch, because I think it's another area in which she has shown good skill, even if she's not like a tremendous physical specimen, even if she doesn't seem to have the strength to just rip people off their feet and fling them around. She has shown a proclivity for fighting in the clinch. So that would be my guess. What do you think?
I think that's probably the right thing. And I think that's a point where as she gets older, she will get physically stronger and more imposing. And if you combine that with improved technique and her drive and her relentlessness, then that's probably the spot that she's best suited to being in. But what you pointed to right now is kind of the problem. Like, she got physically overpowered by Michelle Watterson, who's an atomweight. She got physically overpowered by Rose Namajunas, who is not the most physically imposing and strongest strawweight out there. Now she's going to be fighting Jessica Rose Clark, who is a former bantamweight coming down, who missed weight in her first UFC fight. She's a big she's a big flyweight,
and she's also pretty good in the clinch.
Yeah, she's a pretty good clinch fighter. Like, so that leads to the conclusion. I mean, I think VanZant's going to lose this fight. I think she's going to lose a pretty clean decision. She's going to get hit as she comes in, if she comes forward, or if she sticks around on the outside, I think she's going to get kind of picked apart. I think she will have a speed edge. And if she has committed to being a stick and move out fighter who has improved her distance and has a better array of strikes to throw, then who knows? It could be wrong, but I just don't think so. Rose Clark is really a pretty sharp striker, and used to working in combination, and throws a nice jab, does a good job of setting the distance herself. Just strikes me as kind of a bad matchup for VanZant. Like,
and if that Rawlings fight is any indication, Clark seems really coachable as well. Like, she seems really adaptable because she's one of those fighters whom her coach, I think it was John Wood, of Syndicate who was cornering her, and he was like sort of doing what like Matt Hume does with Demetrius Johnson, sort of controlling her like a video game character, where he was just step by step walking her through clinch exchanges and scrambles on the ground. And she was just following instructions perfectly. She knew his voice. She was very easily complying with what he wanted her to do. And that kind of thing against somebody in Paige VanZant, who is often seems so reckless and wild and just completely without any kind of discipline. I don't know. That kind of thing really sticks out in my mind as an important attribute for a fighter to have. I think that Paige VanZant is going to come into this fight. I don't know. With the camp change, I don't know if she's going to try the outfighter thing, but I think when she starts coming forward, because even against Watterson, even against Namajunas, even against Beck Rawlings, at times she felt she had no choice but to blitz forward. If she does that anything like she did in her older fights, she is going to get lit up worse than by most of her other opponents, because the difference between these two on the back foot is pretty striking. Clark is the exact opposite of VanZant. She seems to have a very good feel for how close she can be to her opponent without being at undue risk, but being close enough to land her own shots just by stepping forward or by letting the opponent step into them. She throws combinations. She seems to have a good eye for openings. She's solid. She's a solid striker. And I think that is going to be the main difference here. If VanZant can't overpower her in the clinch, if she can't hit those square hips of Clark's with a shot, which is not something VanZant's ever been very good at, then she's going to have to strike with her. And I just think Clark is sharper. She's just a better striker, technically speaking. So that's that matchup. And what else were we going to talk about here, Pat?
We had a couple of others.
Usman versus Meek.
Meek.
Damn it. And I know a little German, too. I should have caught that.
He's Norwegian.
Yeah, but it's a Germanic pronunciation. Meek is how the Germans would say it, too. Like a sound rather than E. Emil Weber Meek is taking on Kamaru Usman on this card. What is your take on Emil Weber Meek? He's like a big, strong guy who's kind of good at everything.
Yeah, he's kind of a weird fighter. I think he's pretty athletic. I think he's pretty quick. I think he's got big power in his shots. I think he's tough. I think he knows a little bit of everything. But where I think he is especially good is in kind of in between spaces and scrambles. And I think that's a testament. Like, you see that a lot with guys who are kind of generally physically gifted without being outstanding in any one particular physical area. Just like he's a good athlete and he's got a good sense of balance and a good sense of like how to react in kind of tight spaces. So you see that plays out mostly, I think, in his takedown defense. Like we saw that he almost murdered Husimar Palhares when they fought with elbows in a kind of a takedown defense situation. Jordan Meehan shot good takedowns on him and got him down, but wasn't able to hold him down and got kind of hit while he was doing it. Meek is super tough and he's willing to throw in the pocket. He's kind of and I think the way I described him in my in the preview that I wrote for UFC 206 all the way back like a year ago now for his UFC debut was as a solid, competent, and uninspiring striker. And I kind of stick by that. I think he knows how to do things. He's fundamentally sound. He's getting better. He's getting better at them. But like you're not going to point to any one thing he does and be like, oh my God, I want to do this exactly like Emil Weber Meek does it. So what that means in this matchup is there are ways in which he could be tough for Usman, but probably won't be. Like against a slightly less imposing wrestler, he could be really interesting in those scrambles. Against a slightly less technically sound striker, he could probably make some hay. If I'll say this, if Usman gets wild and aggressive with him the way that he did to try to get Moraes out of there, then he could actually just clean knock out Usman. Yeah, on the feet is perfectly capable of doing that.
My read on Usman's performance against Moraes was that he was sort of looking to make a statement and that he knew that he could get away with doing that to Moraes. I think that's decidedly a more dangerous tack against Meek, and I'm hoping that Kamaru Usman thinks the same. Because even Sergio Moraes, like that's the thing I keep thinking about with this fight. Sergio Moraes was getting in shots on Kamaru Usman. He was landing clean early before Usman found his range and his timing to land that big right hand. It took some doing. And if he was being particularly aggressive just to prove a point, if he was really just focusing on landing the big shot and nothing else, then I think I can kind of forgive that and understand what he was doing. But if that's the way he's going to fight a stronger, younger, a hailer sort of Viking who is perfectly willing to plant his feet and throw multiple punches at a time, he will exchange with Usman coming forward, then I think that's pretty risky. And even if it's Usman setting up his takedowns with those striking combinations, he is still by and large kind of hittable. His defense is not really a standout aspect of his game, and he does still have, to my eye, a little bit of that Gilbert Burns stiffness, a little bit of that sort of roteness to his combinations, where he still looks, against someone who's outmatched, you wouldn't notice, but against someone like Meek, I imagine he will still look a little robotic and a little, I don't know, inorganic. I'm just kind of repeating myself. But
I have a kind of a theory on this, actually, which is that, like, both he and Burns are Henry Hooft trained guys. And I think Henry Hooft trained guys early in their careers look are much better than they have any right to be, just because they know how to throw fundamentals and they know how to throw combinations. They know how to stick multiple shots together, and they know what is supposed to come after what. Then they kind of go through a stage in the middle of their careers where they have trouble because they're confident but haven't picked up the nuances yet. Like, they're probably more confident than they should be in their ability to throw those kinds of shots. Then after they get over a hump, then they're really good. Then they turn out to be really, really excellent strikers, if not great defensively. They're creative. They put together, like, they read their opponents well. They know what's supposed to come after what and how to play with their opponent's expectations. But it takes a little while to get over that kind of slump where, like, just having a coach like that at the beginning of your career is a huge edge. Knowing how to throw fundamentally sound combinations is a huge skill to have right off the bat. And, like, Usman in his first pro fight looked like a guy who knew what he was doing on the feet, and Gilbert Burns too, early in his career, looked like a guy who knew what he was doing on the feet in ways that were surprising. But if you come from a really rote Dutch style background, it can take a while to feel comfortable enough with those things to improvise. I think Usman will eventually get there, but Meek is not the dude you want to mess around with.
Right. Yeah. That's a really interesting point. I think that there's a couple other trainers that I kind of have that give me the same vibe, that where they seem like trainers who definitely have systems, and it takes a little while to really to feel the system rather than having to, like, think out the moves that you've trained.
To feel comfortable improvising within the still effective boundaries that the system imposes on your game.
Yeah, I think Trevor Whitman's fighters look like that sometimes. I think TJ Dillashaw, Dwayne Ludwig's fighters look like that sometimes too, where, like, they first get to him, they suddenly have moves that work and are put together the right way, and then you see them in, like, some messier fights and you're like, okay, It actually takes a little work after that to really get truly comfortable with this system, to really understand it.
You know who's the quintessential example of that? Mark Henry.
That's a very good shout. Yeah, Edson Barboza is, like, a great example of.
Or Corey Anderson is, I think, the quintessential one. A guy who looked better than he had. Well, a guy who looked better than he had any business being early in his career.
True.
Like, on the feet, just, like, did the right things all the time. Shit. And now has kind of gotten figured out by guys. Frankie Edgar, too.
Frankie Edgar, yeah. That's what I was just going to say. Shit, Frankie Edgar was, like, the guy who used to annoy people like you and me, nerds like you and me, when people would be like, oh, his footwork is so amazing, when it wasn't. And now that it's less of what people expect amazing footwork to look like, it's clearly much better. Now, Frankie Edgar's footwork is almost flawless. It's very, very good.
It actually is amazing now.
Yeah.
Like, he actually has the footwork now that he was getting credit for having back in, like, 2012.
Yeah, and the moves were always there. It's just now he seems to really grasp the full nuance and subtlety of what those moves can do.
Yeah, like, Frankie Edgar has such a command of those things that he would be an awesome coach, and I actually hope he coaches when he's done fighting. But okay, leaving that aside, within the context of this matchup, What does that mean for Usman Mek? How do you see this fight playing out?
I think it means that Usman needs to not be too aggressive. I think he needs to be willing to let Mek walk himself into takedowns. And I think he needs to chain shots together a lot. I think he needs to force the scrambler to scramble, because I do believe that in that kind of fight, Usman will be able to outlast and wear Mek down. But I think he's going to have a hard time if Mek either convinces him, or if Usman does what he did against Moraes and decides to come forward and force those wrestling tie-ups through striking exchanges first. Because I think Mek is quite dangerous when you force him to plant his feet and swing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think once Usman gets a hold of him, it's going to be a pretty one-sided fight, because Mek does not have great first-line takedown defense. He likes to scramble and likes to get into those kind of awkward, weird positions. That is just poison against Usman. You cannot let yourself get dragged into that kind of fight, because your ability to scramble is always going to be one or two steps behind his ability to control you and hit you while you're doing it and do damage to you in those positions.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Usman does not actually get enough. There was a while there where people were just calling him boring. And I was like, you guys aren't giving credit to how badly he's beating people up on the ground. Like, he's not fitching these people. It was like the GSP circumstance where, yeah, I know he's holding them down, but he's very dangerous from top position, and he keeps a lot of consistent pressure on with his strikes from the top.
Sean Strickland is a pretty good defensive wrestler and pretty good in the tie-ups and really good on the mat. And Usman beat the shit out of him. Absolutely beat the shit out of him.
My poor boy. Don't remind me of Sean Strickland's terrible fate, when I was really thinking, both of us, in fact, were thinking, he might be the guy to give Usman problems, and just got thrashed in every single phase. And that's
because he's tall and he fights tall and he's got a nice jab and good footwork, and like it looked like it was all there, and we were just very wrong about that.
Yeah. And Usman, I will say this, Usman's chances in every phase, I think, become significantly better after the first round, if that first round includes a lot of him out-wrestling Emil Mek. Because just as it was against Strickland, like, Usman is such a powerful and technical takedown artist and such a very difficult wrestler to escape from on the ground that weighs heavily on an opponent's mind when he comes forward and starts striking with them again after the first round. They have that moment of hesitation of, what's he going to do? Is he going for the shot, or is he swinging at my head? Was enough to turn Sean Strickland into a novice striker. When, in like even striking matchups, he has looked very, very good in the past. So I think that Mek is going to become less and less dangerous at a pretty rapid rate. He's going to decay rapidly after round one if Usman can get those early takedowns off. But I kind of suspect that he will do a lot of wrestling in the first round, because I think Usman's a pretty smart fighter. I think he knew he could get away with that recklessness against Moraes, and I suspect he knows that he can't against Mek. So Usman by decision, possibly a late finish. Sounds about right to me.
Yeah, I think a late finish is going to be it, because yeah, it's just going to be I think it's just going to be too much pressure and too much wrestling and too much clinching. And Mek can hurt Usman in those exchanges, but I think Usman will hurt Mek. Mek is a fun fighter, but he's kind of getting tossed in. I don't think this is going to be the slot where Mek eventually settles in this division as kind of a top 5 guy. Like, there are dudes who can and will, I think, beat Usman in this division, but I just don't think Mek is that dude.
Just quickly before we wrap, why Emil Mek as an opponent for Kamaru Usman?
Because nobody will fight Usman.
Is that really it?
Guys keep turning him down. Yeah, think about it. If you're Carlos Condit, what upside is there to you fighting Usman?
Yeah, I get it. I don't want to fight Usman.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Not very popular. I mean, he is, once again, that infamous combination. He is not popular, not fun to watch, but dangerous. At least from certain fans' perspective, they don't find him fun to watch. I enjoy his fights.
He wanted Maya, and Maya decided to fight Covington instead, is my understanding of that particular situation. I think Till was offered him and turned him down. I think he's had multiple other, he literally just could not find a fight.
Well, at least he's staying busy. Silver lining. But Kamaru Usman needs to be able to break through into that top 10, man. He needs to. He's ready for it. He needs that breakthrough matchup.
I really want to see him fight Colby Covington. That is really, really the fight that I want to see.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think it would be just the grimiest, meanest wrestling exchanges.
Or, as was the case in Maia versus Covington, a mediocre striking match. You never know.
I don't think it would go that direction. I honestly don't think it would go that direction because I think Usman would actually, as good a wrestler as Covington is, I think Usman would actually just overpower him when they got into those kinds of spaces. I think Usman is better technically and much more physically gifted. So, and I don't think Covington is a good enough striker to keep him off.
You might be right. But that's a preview discussion for another day. And that's the end of segment number 2. When we come back, we have one more fight from this card to discuss, that being Darren Elkins versus Michael Johnson in Johnson's featherweight debut. Very interesting matchup there. And then we are going to get to a couple questions from our patrons after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. Darren Elkins versus Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson, the menace, making his featherweight debut after an up-and-down run to end his lightweight career, at least for now. First things first, Pat, we have absolutely no idea how Michael Johnson will look at 145. We can say that he is not a particularly big lightweight. He seems to have a frame that might work for 145, but I will say I've been hearing rumors that he didn't do a test cut of any kind, that he just decided he was going to 145, and this is the first time he's going to try to make that weight. And that worries me a little bit. I have to wonder about the wisdom of such an act. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I don't think that's good. Kind of in general, that seems bad, especially if your gas tank. I mean, and Johnson has a good gas tank and he can push a real pace. But against a guy like Elkins, who is just such a grinder, I do kind of wonder, like, what will that cut do to Johnson's gas tank? Is he going to be able to push the pace that he liked to push beforehand? And will he be able to get out of the wrestling exchanges with Elkins? Especially because he's a guy who can kind of lose heart.
Yeah.
If things are not going his way, and Elkins will just suck the life right out of you.
Elkins is literally the anti-losing heart fighter. He that is the opposite of what Darren Elkins does, and it's definitely part and parcel of Michael Johnson's game. I also wonder about this move because, as a lightweight, the things that set Michael Johnson apart were his speed and his surprising punching power that came with that. The ability to deliver much quicker punches than his opponents were used to from the vast majority of their other opponents. And usually moving down in weight is something you do when you're not worried about being faster than people, or all of your opponents now being closer to your speed. I don't know. I guess that won't be a big problem against Darren Elkins, but I just kind of wonder about this whole move in general. Like, I think 155 is an okay division for Michael Johnson. He's just not going to beat the Khabibs of the world.
Or the Justin Gaethjes, or the Nate Diaz's, or the... I think that's the problem. It's not just that he lost to Gaethje and Khabib. It's that he had kind of hit a wall in terms of the amount of talent that was there. So I think it makes sense from a career perspective. Also, I would say there are fewer guys who have comparable skill sets at 145. I think, like look at the it's just not as deep a division. So you're going to get, like, I would say that if the version of Michael Johnson that we see at 145 is similar to the one we saw at 155, I think he probably beats a guy like Ricardo Lamas, who's currently ranked as the number 6 featherweight in the world. Whereas Johnson was pretty clearly going to be outside the top 10. Like, I think that version of Michael Johnson could beat a Chan Sung Jung, who's currently the 7th ranked fighter in that division. I think he could beat a Yair Rodriguez, who's currently the 8th ranked fighter in that division. Like, with less talent, I think he'd be real competitive with Cub Swanson, who is currently ranked number 5, or with Josh Emmett, who's ranked number 4. Like, those are all winnable fights.
Sure, yeah.
For if Michael Johnson doesn't lose anything from the cut, those are all like winnable fights for him.
Yeah, fair shot. And they may still be competitive matchups, but at least they're new competitive matchups, not the same guys he's already lost to.
Exactly. And Johnson is kind of in the phase of his career where he's been fighting, I think, since 2008 or 2009. So he's coming up on the end of his prime years. If he's probably not going to get a whole lot better skill wise before. Well, he's kind of a finished product skill wise. He'll add some wrinkles, but he's not going to fundamentally transform himself.
Right.
And he's going to probably start to physically decline. So I don't know. I think it makes sense to give it a shot if he feels like he can make the cut, and I think it's a viable move. New surroundings.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely. If I had to pick a lightweight to move down, it would probably be Michael Johnson, based on size and frame. So I can see that. Darren Elkins, a somewhat less imposing but no less determined Khabib Nurmagomedov type. That's what makes this matchup really interesting. All the weight cut stuff aside, Darren Elkins, the comeback machine, who really hasn't spent his whole career coming back against people, but has had a career marked by just tenacity and endurance. And those are the things that Michael Johnson really struggles with. We noted when we were talking about his fight with Justin Gaethje, I think, that he sort of falters. Actually, well, you just brought it up. He sort of folds under pressure and sort of lets the moment get to him. And loses sight of the fight as a whole in the midst of what are the increasingly wild exchanges. And that is a pretty dangerous mindset to have against somebody like Darren Elkins if Darren Elkins doesn't get fucking flattened in the first round. Because while Darren Elkins has some weird craft to his game, and has in weird ways been like more consistent with his striking than someone like Khabib Nurmagomedov, that's mostly, I think, because he's not as good of a takedown artist. And basically the point is his striking is not good. He's excessively hittable and fairly easy to read, especially for a fighter who is known for the accuracy and speed of his hands, even at 145.
Well, okay. I think that Elkins' striking is good for what he wants it to do.
That's fair.
Which is to distract from his clinch entries and his wrestling and to prevent you from just lighting him up with impunity. He throws pretty good counters, and he's actually thrown pretty good counters for years now. Like, he's got surprisingly good timing when he sees a shot coming and can respond to it. I think because he's durable and he's just willing. He sees things with open eyes. He doesn't shy away from exchanges because he thinks he's tough enough to take the shot, and he's got a kind of a mindset where he's like, well, okay, I'm going to hit you right back.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, like, it's part of what makes him such a surprisingly good fighter is guys will shuck off one of his takedowns or a clinch, get to open space and think, okay, now's my time. Now I can let my shots go. And they hit him with 3 or 4 shots, but then he hits them back. So what it does is it prevents guys from like building a kind of snowball momentum and rolling downhill when they shut him down. When they shut down his entries and his clinch and his takedowns, the endless stream of shit that he does when he's got his hands on you, it prevents opponents from being able to just like let their shots go without having to think about the consequences.
Mm-hmm. My question is, what's the barrier of striking skill at which that fails? Because I agree. Like Darren Elkins is one of those kinds of fighters that I love because he does boatloads of shit the wrong way, as I would call it, the wrong way from my perspective. But you know, he does a lot of things wrong, rather, but does them in the right way, where he's taking his eyes off of his opponent when he ducks his head and just sort of like falling out of his stance and doesn't look like he's on balance. But the idea is there, the intent is there, and he knows what he's doing. How much can he get away with, like, that ducking kind of stuff really is what gives me concerns against Michael Johnson, who has a deadly uppercut. His right uppercut and right hook are very good counter weapons to somebody who ducks and blinds themselves by looking at the floor rather than looking at their opponent. Darren Elkins does that kind of stuff a lot. Now, it definitely fits into a larger game with a lot of pressure from the wrestling, and that makes the ugly striking a lot more effective than it would be otherwise. But I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine Michael Johnson not having a lot of striking opportunities early, just as he did against Khabib Nurmagomedov.
Yeah, You were asking what the barrier is, and I think the barrier is effectively a couple steps behind Michael Johnson. I think Johnson has good enough footwork. I think he works at a good enough pace, even if that pace is decreased by him going down to featherweight. I think he jabs pretty well. I think he sets a pretty good distance. And if he can break off and not get sucked into Elkins's game, he's really hard to take down and hold down. What happens is when guys are like one or two steps ahead of him and they drag him into these kinds of like endless things. And even going back to like his fight with Reza Madadi, that was like 2013, same deal. Madadi just dragged him into that kind of fight. Elkins may be able to do it, but I don't think Elkins is put together quite well enough to do that. I think he's going to eat a lot of shots, and maybe that's enough, but like, Johnson has the depth of striking skill to not get predictable. I don't know. Does it sound like we're trying to talk ourselves into this when really there's like a pattern to Johnson's losses, which is that he gets kind of dragged into fights that he doesn't want to be in?
Yeah, I kind of think Darren Elkins is going to win. Like, I don't know. There are too many unknowns for me to have a very clear idea here, specifically things related to that weight cut. If that has taken a hit on Michael Johnson's stamina, which already could be made a problem if you were able to push a steady pace against him, and got him to start like losing his control, losing his cool, then that only strengthens Darren Elkins' late advantage. The thing is like Darren Elkins can definitely be knocked out, and Michael Johnson's probably exactly the type of guy to knock him out. But if Michael Johnson does not knock out or hurt Darren Elkins really badly early in this fight, then I don't know, like, what's he going to do to stop that pressure? What's he going to do to not get that kind of like dragging, slogging, just endless, tiring wrestling game you talked about? Like, that is Darren Elkins' wrestling game. It's not about
Elkins is not. Okay, yeah. Let me point to a kind of a contrast with Khabib or with Gaethje, who presented like let's leave aside the wrestling for a minute and think about the approach that leads to Johnson getting in trouble. And more than anything else, in recent years, it's been relentless pressure that's gotten in his head. It's been guys who just come after him. And Elkins, while a guy who will get after you, is not quite as relentless with his forward movement. Elkins will give you space to breathe on the feet if you break off. He likes to come forward, but he's not Khabib in terms of just the sheer unrelenting constancy of it. Yeah. Like with Khabib, you never buy yourself a break. With Nate Diaz in that fight, Diaz was just constantly throwing, was constantly peppering it, was constantly there. That fight with even the Beneil Dariush fight where Johnson had some issues with that, Dariush was kind of constantly coming after him, constantly getting after it. The Gaethje fight, Gaethje was just always in his face. That, I think, more than the wrestling aspect of it is what causes those problems. Elkins can, but Elkins is going to eat more damage than any of those other guys, except for maybe Gaethje on his way in. Mm-hmm. That would be my case for Johnson. Mm-hmm. Maybe we're trying too hard, or maybe I'm trying too hard here. I'm going to take Johnson just because I think at some level Elkins is going to eat a shot that he can't eat. He keeps getting into these fights and keeps getting the shit kicked out of him. Can he continue to eat those shots forever?
I'm going to ride the Darren Elkins train straight into the clouds, Pat. And just to keep things interesting, I'm gonna go with Elkins. But it does, like, over the course of this discussion, I have become much more interested in this matchup than I already was. Because it's very tough to know how it's going to play out. And Elkins, like, both of these guys are exactly the type of opponent who could give the other problems.
It's great matchmaking, man. Like, that's the thing about all these cards. All these fights are well matched. Like, this is great throwaway violence on a Sunday night.
Absolutely. Like, yeah, for Michael Johnson's first fight, 145, like, what better matchup? What more interesting matchup to test the problems he's had at 155, and likewise for Darren Elkins. How far can he...
These are great. The problem is like any problems that we identify with the present day UFC have nothing to do with the quality of matches like this. It's the lack of overall storylines and narratives that's kind of the problem.
It's like a tactics versus strategy thing. Yeah. What's the big picture that the various competitive matchups fit into? And that's what seems to be lacking. But as we've said throughout 2017, and we'll probably continue to say throughout 2018, the fight-by-fight matchmaking is very strong in the UFC right now. And this is a very good example of that. You were going to say?
So we were going to answer one or two heavy bag questions, right? To finish things up.
Couple questions here. We'll make them relatively quick. I did put a call out on Patreon, but if you're listening to this and you have not checked the Patreon lately, first of all, go back and listen to our 2017 year-end awards, aka the Handies. We spent about 45 minutes giving out our picks for best fight, best fighter, and had, I think, a pretty interesting discussion about the lack of narrative, the lack of driving story and interest in 2017 in the UFC. I thought that was a pretty good episode, so make sure you check that out. And if you are a subscriber, a patron at the $5 level or above, send us your questions and or topic suggestions. We are in desperate need of more, and we like answering your guys' questions. So send those in. Make sure you send them, if you can, as a message on Patreon. Send the message to the Heavy Hands account on Patreon, and that'll be the easiest way for us to make sure we don't miss it or forget it. All right, so our first question here comes to us from Thomas. And I'm not going to read people's last names, which I know I've done in the past, but some people don't like that. So our first question comes to us from Thomas. He asks, how can you improve your own reading of a fight to improve your awareness of what is going on, what's good, and what's bad? Thank you. So Thomas wants to know, he says he still feels a little lost sometimes when he watches fights. How do you get to a point where you have a better grasp of what's happening?
So I think a couple of different things. I would say one is the mindset with which you watch the fight in the first place. Are you watching for fun, or are you watching to try to pick out what's happening in the fight? Those are two different things. So I'm not, to be clear, I'm not advocating that people stop watching fights for fun. That's not at all what I'm saying.
This is not a game, Pat. This is serious business.
This is very serious business. Yeah. I mean, I think there was a point, I can watch a fight for fun, but if I'm just watching a fight for fun, my technical eye suffers. I know this. And right now I tend to watch more fights for fun than I watch for technical things. Reviewings for me are the ones where I pick up the technical stuff.
Same here.
So if I'm watching for technique and it's not live, if I have the capability of pausing and slowing things down, I take advantage of that. Right. So if there's an exchange that I'm particularly interested in, if I'm interested in how a fighter does something, I will go back and rewatch multiple times to try to pick out exactly what went down. So that's one. Another is for a technical viewing where I'm trying to improve my ability to pick those things up. Watch a space between the two fighters. Try to take in the entirety of the fight at once rather than picking out what one individual fighter is doing. Your eye, for whatever reason, is generally going to be drawn more to one fighter than the other. There could be a lot of different reasons for that, but generally rooting interest is the big one. Picking a spot between the two and letting your eyes soften and be drawn to whatever's happening instead of having to move your gaze from one fighter to the other, I think is a helpful thing. That's you can do that if you're watching for fun too. That might actually improve a fun viewing.
Yeah, it can. We mentioned that last week when we were sort of critiquing the judging in Holmes Cyborg, but soft eyes was the phrase that I borrowed from The Wire to describe that, where you just kind of try to unfocus and take in the whole picture, whether it's because you're rooting for one fighter or because you have a neutral feeling towards the fight, but you're constantly drawn to the one who leads and attacks first. It can be very difficult to pick up everything that's happening in an exchange if you allow your eyes to gravitate to just one fighter. So I really do think that's big. Something that I still like to do to this day, that I started doing when I first tried to technically analyze fights, was to find an exchange. I like to find a big moment, something that really catches the eye, a knockout, a knockdown, a submission, whatever you're looking for, something that is like a big decisive thing, something that would appear in a highlight. And then go back 10 seconds at a time and see what preceded it. Watch the fighter's feet before the knockout occurs. Watch their hands and see how they're measuring. I like to say, go back 30 seconds and you can say, this is where the knockout happened. Because 30 seconds before the shot actually landed, do you know what I'm saying? For example, here's an example that will paint what I'm trying to say. Edson Barboza versus Beneil Dariush. Dariush feints a jab or throws a jab and then feints a level change for a takedown. That happens about 30 seconds before he lands the jab and then changes levels right into Edson Barboza's flying knee. And you can look at that flying knee, back up about 30 seconds, and say, this is when that knockout started to occur. This is when it was set up, when Edson Barboza got the idea to throw that shot at that time. Those are the kind of things I think it's really helpful to look for. And you do that just by allowing yourself to watch fights in slow motion if you can, and focus on the big moment, and then try to discern what caused the big moment to happen. Why did they move into the strike that way? How did the person who threw the strike know they were going to move that way? Those are the things I like to look for.
Yeah, I mean, it's important. I realize this now. It's been a long time since this was the case, but like I really did kind of have to teach myself how to watch a fight technically. And so I think maybe we might be a couple of steps ahead in terms of this. But the first thing to do is to just train yourself to pick out what is happening. Identify clearly what's happening. So what strikes are being thrown, what takedowns are being attempted, learn the names of those things if possible. That is helpful. Like, know the difference between a single leg and a double leg. Know the difference between a head inside single and a head outside single. Know what running the pipe means. And be able to, when those things happen in a fight, because they don't look like, when they happen in fights, they do not necessarily look like what you see in a technique video or as somebody is teaching you a perfect version on a mat or in a training session.
Yeah.
Like, be able to pick out what those things look like in practice. So the first time I did a scouting report, it was on Donald Cerrone. It's for Rafael dos Anjos. And
good job.
I remember, well, thank you. This was their 2013 matchup. So this was a long time ago now. What I did the first time I watched those fights through was, I just picked out what are the things that Cerrone is doing. Like, I wrote down every technique that he used. And after a while, you don't need to write down the techniques anymore. I think I just did that because I wanted to test out the method. But like, eventually you stop needing to write it down. You stop needing to identify every single one, and you can start to pluck patterns out of it.
Yeah.
And then once you have the patterns, then you can start to evaluate at kind of a higher level.
Yeah, I got mercilessly teased for trying to defend an other side scoring of Alec Verdiev versus Broner, and I got mercilessly mocked for that. But the method I used to point out that many of those rounds were much closer than the scorecards indicated, which I still believe, even if I don't necessarily still think that maybe Alec Verdiev was like winning that fight, but was like counting down each individual strike that I saw, and also marking down like what the quality of that strike was, how clean did it land, and I don't know, that kind of thing can be really helpful to just kind of catalog for yourself if your goal is to get better at understanding what's happening moment by moment in a fight. If your goal is just to watch fights for fun, you don't have to do this shit, but personally, I think this makes fights more fun. I think that my fun watching becomes more technical after a long time of teaching myself to watch technically, because the momentum swings are really, really momentous when you can pick up on them 20 seconds before they happen, when you know what a fighter is intending before they actually do it, when you've seen enough of these patterns to identify those trends. I think it makes fights more interesting to watch. So thank you for your question, Thomas. We hope our answer was satisfactory, and we will do one more question here. This one is from Twan, is how I'm going to pronounce it, Twan21, T-Wone21. He asks, why are there so few standing elbows in MMA? I assume is the question, because if you were in Muay Thai, there are quite a lot of them. Why are there so few standing elbows in MMA? What advantages or disadvantages are there versus a tight hook? Or is it harder to throw quick combinations? Do you have to turn your hips more to connect? Basically, what are the limitations of standing elbows, if any, that make them a relatively rare weapon in MMA? For me, I think the thing is that elbows are a very specialized weapon. They're not something strikes I think that come very naturally to most people, because you have to typically, when you're tying up with somebody, when you are close enough to throw an elbow, you are engaging with your hands. You have to understand your positioning well enough to be able to basically disengage from the clinch. It's not like a knee, where the leverage you have from the clinch is what allows you to land the knee. The elbow is like it's often like a little opportunistic strike you throw in the midst or while breaking away from controlling somebody's posture or when somebody is resisting your posture. Personally, I just don't think they come as naturally to what are essentially novices of clinch fighting as strikes like knees, even as strikes like uppercuts and punches. When your hand is already right there next to the target, you just ball up your fist and wail away with it.
I think that's all correct, but I think there are a couple of deeper things that underlie that. And the big one is just the difficulty of training them. First of all, there are not that many people in the United States who train who really make clinch elbows or standing elbows a fundamental part of their training regimen of what they put out there. There are not a lot of really high level traditional Muay Thai coaches in the United States.
Yeah,
who are the kinds of people who would be teaching this stuff. They're still kind of it's still kind of a hard to find skill,
except for presumably Paige VanZant's coach.
Yeah. Well, and like, yeah, I mean, so not only are those people hard to find, it's also the fact that the rest of that skill set that you might be teaching does not necessarily apply perfectly to MMA. Like a traditional Thai style game is not in its entirety necessarily the very best way of approaching MMA striking, you know? So even if you are learning those kinds of clinch skills, what you do at range may not be well suited to the rest of, you know, MMA in 2017, 2018. So there's that aspect to it. So I think it's a highly specific skill taught by highly specific people who are not necessarily to be found in great quantities and numbers. Like there are a lot of boxing coaches who can teach you how to properly pivot, you know? There are not a lot of guys who can teach you when and where to throw elbows on clinch entries and exits.
Yeah, and those entries are something we've talked about in the past. Like what always stands out to me about Matt Brown's Muay Thai clinch is like going back to when I went to a seminar where Matt Brown was there. They were talking about the clinch, and it was said that like the clinch begins here, and both fighters just have like their hands touching at long range. They are basically at jabbing range, but to a fighter like Matt Brown, like that is where the clinch potentially begins, because you can pat down a hand, step forward, and now you're in elbow range. Now you've got control of an arm. That's the kind of stuff that I think MMA fighters also tend to struggle with, aside from just not being able to train elbows as easily, because even Muay Thai fighters don't get to train full power elbows in their sparring. It's not something they do. Although I guess it does help when you fight like 3 times a week that you just end up throwing a lot of elbows with force. But most MMA fighters, it's a broad generalization, but most MMA fighters not super confident in their like boxing ranges, not super confident in like slotting between them and knowing exactly what moves to make in the pocket. Some of that is because they train so many other things. Some of it is because the way the sport works, there's just a lot of options that could possibly come at you. And so it's much harder to build a defensive system around that to give yourself confidence in the pocket. But being able to step in and wind your way through, using your hands not to strike as the nearest weapon to your opponent's face, but to wind your way into a position to land elbows, I don't know. I think that does not come naturally to many people. It sure as hell doesn't come naturally to me.
Yeah, I mean, like I worked with coaches who trained elbows a lot. Like we did a lot of work with elbows, and it's still kind of hard to, because the range is weird and the arc of the strike is weird. And like, yeah, it really takes a ton of practice to feel comfortable with it. The only elbow strikes I ever felt really comfortable with were the kinds of shots that like Matt Brown finished Diego Sanchez with, like where you've kind of got some time to line the shot up, and then throw it. Like I felt comfortable with that, and I felt comfortable with like knee elbow combinations on the break. So like you break off, you throw a knee on the break, and then as you come down from the knee, you follow that with an elbow on the same side. Like I felt comfortable throwing that. Just because it felt like a really natural motion and a natural range to be at.
Yeah, just like throwing a kick and then coming back with a punch from the same hand. Something a lot of MMA fighters do quite well. Comes pretty naturally, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So those, I don't think it necessarily has to be this way. And there are ways, I would say, for elbows to kind of percolate more into best practices. that get taught all over the place in a whole bunch of different gyms. Because I would say it's one of the few areas where outside of strategy or kind of broad contextual things, like it is a literal strike that is incredibly useful, that should be used more. Like we get questions about like, why aren't side kicks used more, like hook kicks or things like that? Well, there are limited uses for those things. People are in the freaking clinch and breaking into and exiting the clinch all the time.
Yeah.
Like there are dozens of opportunities in every fight for them.
And it's not like a side kick. There are dozens of kinds of elbows you can throw. You know what I mean? It's a whole category of strikes. It's another limb, essentially. And so not throwing elbows at all is really robbing yourself of a whole range of possible attacks. My personal favorite, the slapping elbows that Matt Brown used to throw so well, and which Rafael dos Anjos has now gotten into the habit of throwing, where, as I remember Matt Brown putting it, you really hurt your arm when you land it with the inside of the elbow, but it's a very sneaky and cool strike. Elbows are badass, and they should be trained more, and they should be used more. But how to do that? I mean, here's the thing. Before we wrap up, not to drag it on too much, but you can ask, why aren't there more elbows? But if I am in part correct, if it is something about not being comfortable with the range, I think you could just as well ask, why aren't there more combinations of short punches? Something else that's not very common in MMA. People standing in the pocket and trading with like short punches, uppercuts and hooks, and stringing them together. That's not super common either. There's not a lot of people who are comfortable enough in their boxing to do that. So,
all true. You know who throws really nice short punches and elbows?
Who's that?
Justin Gaethje.
Justin Gaethje. Justin Gaethje is the patron saint of heavy hands. I mean, the show's called Heavy Hands, for God's sake.
He actually is our patron saint. Yeah. Like that's not an exaggeration or anything. Like that is just an actual true fact stated.
Mm-hmm. And so we will now, before we close out the show, ask Justin Gaethje to interpose on our behalf, speak Saint Justin to the MMA gods, and make sure that UFC St. Louis is a thrilling and exciting show. We beseech thee. All right, before we wrap up, what do you have coming out this week, Pat?
Not a whole lot. I have a lot of kind of long-term projects that are percolating right now. I don't think any articles coming out. Next week, I will have a new episode of Tides of History, a new narrative episode. Last week, I had an interview with Kyle Harper, who's a professor of classics at the University of Oklahoma. He just wrote a book on climate change, plague, and the end of the Roman Empire, which I give my full stamp of approval to. Highly recommend it. But yeah, it's kind of slow. I'm working on a piece, a long piece on millennials and migration and why highly educated millennials leave home for elsewhere and don't return, leave places like the city where I grew up. So I'm interviewing as many of my high school classmates as I can about their lives, about why they left, about why they can't or won't go back to the place where we grew up and how they feel about it. So that's nice. But this is that's like a months-long project, like I'm interviewing like 15, 20 people. I'm pulling econometric data. Like that's a long project. So upshot, nothing soon.
Love it though. Sounds good. Sounds like a very interesting concept. And as for me, you're welcome. It's kind of the same circumstance. I'm still working on that matchmaking piece. Still got that one in the can. Might come out this week. Might not. But it's actually a pretty involved topic to address, how matchmaking affects narrative and momentum, and how that was not present in UFC in 2017. It involves a lot of going back to watch old events and going through records and trying to piece together a total narrative. It's almost like being a historian, Pat, except I just get to mostly sit in front of a computer. So, is there like a cool MMA archive somewhere in the world where there's just like old UFC VHSs with like this, like an idiosyncratic archivist, and you have to like become best buds with him and gain his trust before you're allowed to watch UFC 3 in its original format? God, I hope so. Anyway, thank you guys for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the show as much as we did. We hope this new year is going fantastically well for you so far, and we hope you, like us, are looking forward to UFC St. Louis, especially that main event between Jeremy Stephens and the Korean Superboy, Ho Choi. Until next time, we'll leave you with these words. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.